Much. You set a very high bar for a successful talk. I'll only know it worked if you all leave. But I'm just so pleased to be here and to be participating in this conference and communicating with the best cryptologists of the world. It does just make me wonder who's minding the store. It seems like havoc could be wrought elsewhere while we're in here. But in the meantime, I wanted to talk a little bit about the end of crypto, and I'll explain what I mean by that. It's true, as Ron sort of suggested, that I have sometimes been somewhat pessimistic in my work. That includes a book I wrote a few years ago now called The Future of the Internet and How to Stop It, with a cover that sort of indicates two possible paths without indicating which is the good path and which is the bad one. And I thought I would open by kind of updating some of the thoughts within that book to the modern day and explain why some of the worries I have persist and how they link to the building blocks of our digital environment, which increasingly are built out of crypto. Now, the way I frame it historically is by looking at first the IBM System 360. I imagine a number of you are now thinking, good times. But this, to most people, is the kind of device for which it very clearly signals that if you go anywhere near it, you will die. But it was a sort of general-purpose device. You could reprogram it in a heartbeat. But again, it was not meant to be accessible to mere mortals. There's sort of a priesthood of people around it, and they're the only ones that got to program the System 360. Now, around that era, there were other pieces of technology more accessible to people. I would include in that those are, by the way, of course, some of the wonderful punch cards that worked in the System 360, complete with the diagonal line to indicate, if you had a friend toss them all over the floor, how to reassemble them in a semblance of their original order. But there was the Freedom Flexowriter. Now, I don't know if there are a lot of people that are like, ah, yes, the Flexowriter. This is a little bit World War II vintage, but a standard typewriter with that wonderful piece of tape along the side of it. And it's that tape that had little indentations made as you would type, and then if you played the tape back through, the indentations would indicate what should be typed out to echo back what you had typed before, and with scissors and glue you could copy and paste your way to mail merge. The Flexowriter ended up with its own descendants, things like the Brother Smart Word Processor of latter vintage. Some of you may remember that. You turn the thing on, and anything you could possibly want to do is there on the ever-unchanging main menu. So this is a good example of a consumer device that is accessible to everybody, but not reprogrammable, even if the chip inside could hypothetically be redirected to another purpose. For most people, it couldn't. And my claim is, prior to the advent of the PC and the Internet, these were the two models of technology we had out there. Reprogrammable stuff that you couldn't get to if you were a normal person, and non-reprogrammable stuff that you could get to, but then again, you couldn't reprogram it. And that held true for all sorts of consumer devices. This is the standard Princess telephone, which has all sorts of features to it. It has an illuminated dial, and you can keep it on as a nightlight. Like, there's a kind of dual-purpose device for you. And it had its own counterpart, starting, for instance, to rely on and embed crypto. Here's the famed STU-3 telephone, secure telephone unit. You always knew if somebody in the embassy was using it because they were shouting at the top of their lungs in order to be heard properly through the various encrypting and decrypting. Yes, Whitfield Diffie's like, no, the STU-3 is quite good. But it might have just been the connection then that had the most sensitive secrets be the ones that were loudest shouted. So that was kind of our model for embedding security and cryptography into our devices. And it meant that whatever balance would be struck, however strong it would be, whether or not there would be backdoors, all this sort of stuff would be in the province of the manufacturer of the device. It wasn't up to you, the user, to do anything but pick up the phone, put in the key, and try to use the thing. Now, I say all of that changed in 1977. Here is a 21-year-old Steve Jobs introducing the Apple II computer at the West Coast Computer Fair in 1977, using a television set as the monitor. Great excitement there. Of course, this is the kind of device that when you first turned it on, all you got was a blinking cursor. And so that's not the most useful thing to most people, but to the right kind of person, it was an invitation to code and then to be able to share that code with everybody. which is why within 2 years of the introduction of the Apple II, you had Bob Frankston and Dan Bricklin introduce VisiCalc, the first digital spreadsheet ever, and the entire world was like, OMG, and you suddenly had Macs flying off the shelves. And there was no idea within Apple as to even why this was happening. They had to do market research to figure out how their computer had gotten so popular. And that's what I call a generative or civic technology, one that is open to contribution from almost anywhere and that can surprise us with where people will take it. Now, in 1977, at exactly the same time, Bill Gates was being pulled over for speeding in Albuquerque, New Mexico. What I love most about this photo is, first, he's, of course, grinning from ear to ear, knowing that someday he will buy and sell us all, and that fashion has not changed significantly in the intervening time. And it's this kind of guy that could bring us then into the mainstream, out of Apple and into the world of the IBM PC and MS-DOS and later Windows, this kind of box, which has as its fundamental aspect that you hand it code, it runs the code, like the IBM System 360, but it's right in front of you, and there's no intermediaries between you and it. It combines the reprogrammability of the 360 with the accessibility of something like the Friden FlexiWriter. And that one feature was the spark that gave rise to the past 30-plus years of innovation we have seen in the consumer digital environment. It's what gave rise to the idea of off-the-shelf software, for which Microsoft had no hand in picking what would be on these shelves, neither did Apple. Anybody could write it, anybody could sell it, or give it away. VisiCalc, free software, you name it, it can be in your hands. And the same goes then with these civic technologies that can end up with great success beyond expectation. The same story goes for the network. So I remember back in the day, I was 76703,3022. That's right, the project programmer number was octal in CompuServe. So if you saw an ID with a 9 in it, you knew somebody was up to no good. And that was the CompuServe information manager. It's like the Brother Smart Word Processor menu. Pick all these sorts of things you want to do. They want you to be happy. But those icons are fixed at a central location. It's not like somebody wants to throw up a new icon. They can do that and put it in front of you without CompuServe's say-so. That was thought to be the future of networking until, truly out of left field, came into the mainstream the Internet. Here, of course, pictured 3 of its founders in their 25th anniversary retrospective photograph for Newsweek. And they're showing, first of all, that people can build serious technology and still be total goofballs, which was not to be understood from the likes of CompuServe. They were a subsidiary of H&R Block, the most serious people ever. And they're showing, too, that their idea was to build a network out of just about anything. And once it was built, they get out of the way. They are not the ones to say with whom you communicate. They come up with a scheme of IP addressing, and then the only purpose of the network really is to make sure that any point can communicate with any point, using all sorts of points in between, and to trust those points in between to be willing to route the data like a fire brigade or beer at a Red Sox game from one end of the room or the country or the world to another. And you put the two together, and you get something really special. Now, there was doubt as to whether TCP/IP could work, both, I think, arising out of its culture and arising out of the idea of best efforts networking and allowing intermediaries not in privity with one another to handle other people's data. As late as 1992, IBM was fond of saying you couldn't possibly build a corporate network using Internet Protocol, and that's why the Internet Engineering Task Force says its mascot, if they had one, would be the bumblebee, because the fur to wingspan ratio of the bumblebee is said to be far too wide for it to be able to fly, and yet somehow the bee flies. It's a total mystery until about 2006, when it turns out with massive government funding, we finally figured out how bees fly. It turns out they flap their wings very quickly. All right, so you end up with a neutral network and generative endpoints that can be reprogrammed at any time, and that's how, of course, good old Tim Berners-Lee can just be like, hi, everybody, I've invented the web. Here's a spec for a server. Here's a spec for a client. Go to town. The world's like, we're on it. Like, that's incredible that that could come out of such an unlikely place. And in fact, it was so unanticipated that some of you may remember for quite a while, Windows 95 had no support for internet connectivity. It took a guy named Robert Tatum at the University of Tasmania, you're seeing here playing his favorite instrument, the trumpet, to invent WinSock, trumpet WinSock, that you would get up and running. Remember, good times on your Windows 95 machine in order to connect. The most important piece of software of its era, the final golden spike linking these instrumentalities together, coming from Tasmania, shareware for people to use as they please. And it's stuff like that that then lets the web exist and be consumer-friendly and not have any intermediaries, which is how you get sites like this, catsthatlooklikehitler.com, and people can just submit their favorite cats that look like Hitler. And I don't know about you, but like cat number 4, I do not know what I would feel coming home to that cat every day. But the point is, first, that you can get just random stuff that people are like, I see no business model for this. It's like, it doesn't matter. It's a cat. Or the Wheel of Cheese Cam in Somerset, England. Like, the amount of human effort that goes into being able to show any of us sitting in this auditorium a ripening wheel of cheese live at any moment is incredible. But there's another piece to this, which is that because all of this stuff is generated out of left field, of course, these cats could be steganographic vehicles for absolutely anything. These cats could be harboring true evil, much like their namesakes. And I see then the development of this as something in the late 90s, mid-90s. We saw law enforcement, governments around the world starting to bestir themselves to say, hey, maybe we have a problem here. If we can get to the point where people can end up with a princess telephone with a key icon on it, press the key, and be able to entertain an encrypted conversation with anybody with a similarly situated phone, that's not good. That puts our alligator clips to shame, which is why we saw in the US the Communications Assistance to Law Enforcement Act passed in the mid-90s in order to ensure that the likes of AT&T and such, at least as they moved their own networks in the middle to digital instrumentality, to have that be something that would be eavesdroppable, preferably even without the alligator clips. And it's why we saw the debate, dare I bring it up, over the Clipper chip back in the day, and other such things such as export limitations on encryption, all of which we know feel as if they've gone by the by, but this was the moment where it seemed as if the availability of encryption at the election of the user, not controllable by any intermediary like the manufacturer of a phone, was the kind of thing that seemed as if it might really change the status quo. But in the meantime, this story ends up with a snake in the garden, because as you get more and more users, it becomes riper and riper and more profitable for somebody to make a mess out of it. There's some reason to want to subvert this system, as simple as wanting to send somebody spam, as complicated as wanting to spy on everything they do. And that kind of threat comes from the fact that these civic technologies, like the internet, like the PC, welcome contribution from all corners. So we got to a point circa 2007, 2008, where you have a machine, it's running a whole pile of junk on it, and I presume that the people in this room know enough not to say that you can tell me what each one of these different running tasks does, right? We know enough to know the true fear. We have peered into the abyss and seen that if just one of these lines representing a task has within it a particular piece of code in it that says delete the hard drive, that's it. It deletes the hard drive. Or any other number of tasks that, like 99.9 almost % of the time, it's a dancing hamster. But there's that one moment where it chooses this hamster has fangs, and now you're in trouble. So that's why I kind of think of it almost like the princess and the pea, something like that, that just the smallest piece of poison in something can end up disrupting the entire environment. And that, by the late decade, started to make really, to me, surreal things happening. I mean, you have this out of network world, the storm worm fighting back against researchers that seek to destroy it. It launches DDoSes against them, shutting down their access for days. This is a great quote. As you try to investigate Storm, it knows and it punishes. It fights back. They're afraid. I've never seen this before. It's like, is this a Script 24 or network world? Like, how did we end up with this as our mainstream technology? Like, I'm all for the wonderment of generative open civic systems, but the fact that it can be reprogrammed means that at any moment you can have code that puts it to a rather unusual use. And that has not changed today. When you see some of the code running around out there and you see the admissions of the antivirus makers, that they basically have very little clue how to deal with this problem, I say we have a big elephant in the room, and the promise, one of the underlying promises of crypto, that says we can figure out a way for, you know, Alice to talk to Bob and nobody in the middle can hear it, runs into some practical problems that says, well, actually, are we better at doing that today than we were 4 years ago, my fellow members of the world? And I think the answer may, in fact, be no. Now, I have described the problem fundamentally as this, the cap and crunch whistle problem. You may have also heard this from Matt Blaze at AT&T, that basically our networks and machines have the problem represented by the use of a cap and crunch whistle, right? To blow the whistle covering one hole, you end up with the tone at 2600 hertz, and back in the day, that was the tone indicated in the AT&T network for an idle line, blow the whistle, free long-distance telephone calls. And boxes of cap and crunch cereal flying off the shelves. General Mills has no idea that there's been a new third-party app for the cereal found that's extremely creative, and it's a nightlight. And this is the problem because the channel of communication was also the channel of control. There was a sound you could utter that directed the network rather than that got carried through simply to the other person on the phone call. That AT&T, as the monopoly telephone provider, they could fix. They just introduce out-of-band signaling. They run the whole thing. They can do that. The PC and the Internet can't do that. The purpose of it is, for the very pathways that carry data, music, email, you name it, also to carry code designed to reprogram the device. You want to see the dancing hamster? You want some client-side code? Yay, Internet. You can click, download it, run it, and away you go. And you can even now, as we know, get this down to the hardware level. All of the innards of this are just software instantiated in firmware, and I don't know, can you trust your router? Can you trust your innards of your computer not to be compromised in some way? And I'm kind of curious to ask, I don't know, how many among us actually put some tape or something over their webcam just as an analog? Whitfield Diffie, we have a winner. Anybody else? Just a few hands. How many are seriously considering doing it now that Whitfield Diffie does it? Okay, I see a few more hands going up. So this is absurd that we are having to do analog gapping. I mean, talk about tinfoil hat territory, because we can't even trust the thing fresh out of the box from the factory not to be doing something that we don't want it to do. So one important question, I think, that's important to ask that bears on the end of crypto is, what good is end-to-end encryption that has been so wonderfully honed if the endpoints aren't secure? If at any point you can end up with your endpoint compromised because you pressed the wrong button at the wrong time, what good is end-to-end encryption? Especially because that key has to live somewhere. Where do we secure it if it's living on the very device that is not secure? And we see the same story played out in the network environment. So this is one of the orders from Pakistan's government saying that there shall be filtering by Pakistani ISPs of certain faraway websites. And some of you may be aware, in 2008, when Pakistan sought to block YouTube within the country, one particular telecoms provider chose to do so by simply announcing a new path in the routing table to YouTube, saying that they were YouTube and that they were closer and more specific than any other advertised prefix for YouTube. And the way, of course, that Border Gateway Protocol works and that Internet routing works, the magic of it, the trust built within it, is what kind of lunatic would advertise a path to something that wasn't a real path? That's crazy talk. No one would ever do that until somebody does that, at which point you end up seeing that from t equals 0, everything's fine, and then suddenly you can't get to YouTube anywhere in the world because the bad advertised route doesn't just affect the Pakistani subscribers. It's gone around from ISP to ISP, and now if you're sitting in Santa Barbara, you can't get to YouTube because your packets are helpfully now going to Pakistan and not coming back. So it takes 2 hours to sort out that simple false advertisement, and secure BGP still remains kind of a gleam in our eye. Someday maybe we can work it out. But it's really hard to change the engines on the aircraft while it is in flight. So this is another example of a BGP bug, or was it, where I love it generates headlines like this from Fox News. Internet traffic was redirected via Chinese servers 15%, as measured in bits, I don't know, was briefly redirected through China. Not immediately clear whether the incident was deliberate. I don't know. These things happen. You know, those bits, once they get going, they get going. Again, this is a surreal situation to find ourselves in, which shows the network having vulnerabilities as fundamental as those of the classic PC endpoint. And of course, I just can't help but share like my favorite, most profoundly unnecessary security vulnerability ever, when the makers of Bitly, realizing there was a sudden demand, thanks to Twitter, for shortened links, say, bring us your links, we'll hand you back a Bitly link, and then everything is shorter, but then every time that link is clicked, it comes momentarily through Bitly. And why is it LY? Because it makes it adverbial, of course. And where is LY located? Yes, it's the Libya TLD, which meant for quite a while, if Muammar Gaddafi had a bad day, he could make every single Bitly link go dead. Most unnecessary security vulnerability ever. So, all right, how have we dealt with this stuff? Let me just share kind of 3 zones in which we've tried to deal with it. And I've come up with this probably ill-labeled but maybe helpful way of thinking about it. And that is, for any given system, you can see it being top-down or bottom-up. And by that I mean, is it a civic or generative technology? Is it a technology for which the users of the system are on roughly equal terms to introduce changes into the system through some form of collective hallucination? If the answer is yes, it's bottom-up. If the answer is no, it's top-down. Most stuff is top-down, and probably want it to be that way. Your automobile comes from General Motors by gum, and if there's a problem with it, you know whom to call. That's top-down. Bottom-up is something like the internet or the PC, for which its uses are coming from all over the place, and anybody can dream up and then deploy a new use like Napster. And here is the idea of hierarchy or polyarchy. And by that I mean, within the system, do you have a lot of choice about your participation in the system, or are you somehow bound to it in a way that creates hierarchy? And for many systems, like the internet starts out polyarchical. You can see Paul Vixie dreams up the real-time black hole list to get rid of spam. And if you're on Paul's bad list, you can't send mail to Paul. But then Microsoft Hotmail subscribes to Paul's list. Now I can't send any mail to Microsoft subscribers if Paul doesn't like me. And I remember Paul being like, this is weird, but good. And you'd end up with, then, something that starts off in a corner. Hey, it's just my list. You know, people are free to take it or leave it, becoming a de facto hierarchy. If Paul doesn't like me, I can't send mail. And as we saw a proliferation of spam blacklisting providers, it got weird. I don't know if people remember the ORBs, the Open Relay Behavior Modification System. They were a fully automated system that sent test emails to open relays, and if they could mail themselves, then they knew to list the open relay as bad and put them on their bad list. And I asked Paul about it once, and Paul was like, yeah, I don't agree with that kind of mechanized thing. I believe in the human component. In fact, I think that the emails that they send as tests are spam. I said, what did you do? He said, I listed them. Like, Orbs is now on Vixie's list. I said, what did they do? He said, they listed me. And I was just like, whoa, sometimes even the Pinkertons are shooting at one another. So anyway, here we now have possible ways of dealing with it. And let's start with just this corner, which is the bottom-up polyarchical corner, which I kind of think of as the anarchist corner. This is self-help. It's like, do what you like, and nobody else has to follow you, but maybe that can help. So that's kind of just grab your gun and hope for the best, which I think probably is best represented within this room. That's the kind of like, well, my machine is hardened against attack because I've got a Post-it note over my camera. So The problem with that is you have to be extremely vigilant. Every scrap of code you run, have you personally inspected? It's like, well, no, but you know, it's SourceForge. What could hurt me? It's SourceForge. Or you see here, and this is where you have some automated stuff helping you, but then it throws up something that's like, I know you want to run the UML creator, but there's a problem with it. Do you want to continue? Now, most people on a Friday night have just asked for the hamster to dance. They get this. Of course they're going to say continue. Otherwise, what's the point? So this turns out not to be the best defense. These are the kind of people from if you're like, yes, make sure it's digitally signed. They do not think of this. They think of, oh, a digital signature. It's a digitized signature. It's the same thing. And they're kind of wondering, why don't people just copy and paste digital signatures? I don't get it. That's the kind of people that are not going to be able to execute self-help. And you see the contortions gone through to get them to help one another or to help themselves. This is an email to Harvard Law School faculty and staff about an insurgence of fraudulent emails at the law school. And it talks about all the things you need to do not to get infected with a rootkit. My favorite of which is this: be weary of emails that have misspellings, poor grammar, or odd characters. They are a red flag for fraud. I wrote back, I was like, I think I got one. They sent me to Oxford for 3 years. So not the most helpful thing if what we want is mainstream consumer adoption of civic and generative technology. So then you say, okay, well, how about this corner? Top-down hierarchy. The prototypical inhabitant of this corner is government. That's the purpose of government. An ideally representative government, so it represents us, but in the meantime, they get to make the rules, and the badge separates them from us. We don't get to make the rules. They make the rules, and the rules are supposedly for the greater good. And we saw, for now almost a decade, our federal government in the United States very concerned about cybersecurity. This is Richard Clarke's extremely long report on a strategy to secure cyberspace, about 3/4 of which was digital Pearl Harbor, beware, beware, and the last quarter of which is, I have no idea what to do about this. The most tangible thing was, let's create an IT information sharing and analysis center. So there it is. I think that's Jack Bauer or Steve Case or somebody. And they're just going to monitor everything. And if the internet goes down, they're like, the internet's down. Let's tell people, we can't. The internet's down. It's like, this is the problem of a distributed system, that you can't easily secure it with the metaphor or the reality of sending in the Marines. But you saw, this is from 2004, George Tenet, head of the CIA at the time, he gives a talk calling for new security measures for the internet. I love how the associated ad is for Napster. And here's where he said, access to networks like the web might be limited to those who can show they take security seriously. Yes, that's what we'll do. And I love how the national press were excluded from the event at his request. It's like, this will never get out. So, you know, kind of reaching towards realizing it's a big problem, but really hard to come up with big solutions. This idea fell somewhat flat. The Lieberman-Collins bill about granting the president emergency internet power. Is it a kill switch or not? And then the follow-on reports, they're really frustrated. It's not a kill switch, people. Stop worrying about that. Look, the president has had a kill switch for some time under a little-known provision of the Communications Act of the December 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor, which is an extremely forward-looking act to provide for a kill switch for the internet. But you also see them talking about, well, maybe we should have perimeter defense. Let's just put into the routers an always updated set of signatures of bad stuff. And then we'll just have perimeters where anything trying to enter America that is bad will be stopped. What could possibly go wrong? And this is sort of the problem where the solutions we know are possibly what we call iatrogenic. They carry with them their own harmfulness, so that, wait a minute, those signatures probably can't stop easily the more sophisticated viruses and malware, but they could stop political speech or you name it. Are we sure we want to go down this path? You have other people saying that the biggest problem right now on the net is the so-called attribution problem. It's too easy to be anonymous. It's hard to attribute acts that are bad to the people who are doing them, and as a result, you cannot deter them or arrest them. And that's a real problem. And you see it ending up then with some government officials saying we need to re-architect the internet to allow for better attribution. Now, that again, I think, carries with it its own problems. I won't go into them here except to point you to this wonderful essay by Clark and Landau, Untangling Attribution, which explains umpteen reasons why this isn't the best idea in the world, even if it's well-meaning. But you still end up with organizations at any moment saying, we can do better. This is the International Telecommunications Union. Of course, it's a UN body now. It's extremely well organized, much more so, say, than the Internet Engineering Task Force, which rejects kings, presidents, and voting. They believe in rough consensus and running code. That's their motto. The ITU is really into voting and kings and presidents. Members of the ITU are states of the world. And that's how they, in their own way, decide that for international telephone prefixes, the US is 1 and Ecuador is 593. So they have a focus group on next generation networks known as the FGNIGNIGN, and they have come up with their own map of a brand new next generation network. What could possibly go wrong? It has a number of functions precisely designed not to let two people simply exchange data. That is too dangerous, both because they might exchange data that the third party has an interest in, think intellectual property, think classified material, or it might be that these two people are clueless and what they are exchanging as data is malware. And to help them out, we're going to have something in the middle stop them. So that's what the something in the middles are here. And you can see, though, it still connects to the old telephone network. And oh, yes, here's a brown box called Internet off to the side that it would connect to. But that's going to be a legacy thing. So I, as you might guess, for reasons I don't have time to share right now, I'm somewhat skeptical of these sorts of things. So then you end up with, all right, well, how about this corner? It's still top-down. You don't get to say how it's going to work, but you get choices. And that typically is the corporate corner. You get to choose from among different products, none of which are products you make yourselves. And that carries with it problems, because you're like, okay, we're going to make it really easy. Here's a key. It's got a number. Just type in the number and everything will be safe. Right? That's what I thought until, of course, it turns out, well, no, not so much. There are problems in the implementation. But that's okay. They're going to send us a bunch of new tokens. So these are even better and more secure than the last tokens until it turns out, no, actually, they're not. Scientists penetrate hardened security devices in under 15 minutes. And where did we just hear about that? Oh, that's right. This will be presented at Crypto 2012. Wow. So find out more about it on Wednesday. Great stuff, but making it extremely hard to have confidence in the systems that come that you can't otherwise penetrate or look into as a customer. And of course, these are also the sources that are trying to deploy crypto not simply to enable secure communication between people, but to enable the kinds of things the ITU network is concerned about. So I remember, this is back in 1998. Stephen King released a book so bad that even he just didn't want to release it the normal way. So it was an experiment in DRM, riding the bullet. And you would just click on these buttons, and it would go do that simulated page-turning sound to put you at ease, and you could read it on your computer, but you couldn't copy it. And he ended up releasing it free, but MIT researchers cracked it anyway, just for fun. And in the meantime, you see here the discovery in 2005 of a CD that you were, just a music CD from Van Zandt, you were going to put into your drive. And in order to make sure you wouldn't rip it and share it, it installs a rootkit on your computer to monitor everything to make sure that at no point you rip this disk forever. And that turned out to be a bad idea. Sony got sued over it. This was the offending disk, Get Right with the Man, which is kind of appropriate. And in fact, it was on a few other titles. I have three favorites of the Sony titles that carried this. The Invisible Invasion, I thought was good. Suspicious Activity, also good. But my favorite was Healthy and Paranoid Times. So truly what we're living in. So we have seen efforts by the first quadrant, the upper left quadrant, that is. I'm confusing mathematicians right now. The upper left quadrant to the government to try to influence what's going on in the upper right quadrant, which I've defined as the corporate quadrant. So this is from 1992, the Audio Home Recording Act, which, terrified by what digital audio tape recorders could do, as kids just would make copies of copies of copies, and they'd all be as good as the originals, they just simply mandated in the United States that nobody is allowed to import, distribute, or manufacture a consumer DAT recorder without the serial copy management system. You might ask, what is the serial copy management system? Well, it's funny, because in this act, there's a ton of definitions, including the definition of children. which are immediate offspring, whether legitimate or not. But there is no definition of the serial copy management system. We're all just going to know it when we see it. So this is sort of an odd exercise in government standard setting that did at least achieve its unstated goal of killing the industry for digital audio tape recorders. And they lived to fight another day until Napster came along. And we have seen, though, it's worth just disinterring them for a moment to sort of kick them and make sure they're not stirring. You see things like the SSSCA, the Security System Standards and Certification Act, never passed, which said that PCs would have to have within them certain limitations so that they would respect copyrighted bits as they were identified. And this was its legitimate offspring to the CBDPTA, the Consumer Broadband Promotion and Telecommunications Protection Act, which said the same thing. These things didn't quite pass, but they're there. And we've seen other countries around the world, some may remember Green Dam Youth Escort in China, looking to say we need to build in cryptographically something into a machine so that the user is the untrusted party and that the third party is now the first party, namely the producer of bits that might be going through the machine. Now we see other instances in which, switching back away from intellectual property into the security zone, that these two are relating to one another. So here is the idea of saying we need to move to an environment that's basically sandbox, that we only run stuff that's good rather than run everything unless it's marked as bad. And we start to see instantiations of that in devices and areas that I think represent the future of the digital consumer environment. So this, of course, was the iPhone as it was introduced in 2007. And we have Steve Jobs saying, look, we're going to define everything that's on the phone. The last thing you want is for it to be a PC, because we know with the Princess and the Pea problem just how bad the PCs are. And that's how I say from all of these sectors, what we see after the genuine threat to the success coming from the very openness of the system, solutions that result in a movement towards enclosure. Now, in the iPhone story, we saw a year later the software development kit introduced. Now, until then, it was just CompuServe. It was exactly that. Here are the icons, and you just can go where Apple says you'll go. Then they say, all right, we're going to release an SDK. And really a souvenir edition of Newsweek here that came out about it. And there's going to be some opportunity then for third-party software developers to introduce stuff. But it's not going to be like the Apple II of 1977. Instead, Steve Jobs will say what gets into the store, and the store is supposed to be the only source of stuff for the phone. And what won't he allow? Illegal, malicious, privacy, porn, bandwidth hog, and my favorite, unforeseen. Can't have anything unforeseen on the iPhone. And that had led, of course, to apps like Freedom Time, which counted down the amount of time till the end of George W. Bush's term, and that was all it did, rejected from the store. This guy actually wrote to Steve Jobs about it, and he wrote back, and he's like, look, I'm democratic, but why should I allow an app that'll insult half my customers? And, like, that's it. So you start to see the anchoring of a system, which at the bottom of the stairway is cryptologically based, trying to make it so that you don't run code that you'll regret later, inevitably gets into running code that others might object to. And this isn't just a story about phones. We know that now. I don't think we knew that in 2008. Most of us didn't. But it turns out, of course, you either have a device that just ends up with a keyboard attached to it but still has the store, or come on, let's just bring the store onto the computer and set almost all of the defaults so that you can't run outside code. Now, my belief is it makes it more secure. Does it make it, like, philosophically more secure? No. Practically, probably yes, because you have a new gatekeeper that can take out the worst of the worst. Then again, just 2 days ago, we saw an Android, which allows off-roading more easily. Right? Here's over 500,000 Android devices infected by the SMS zombie. And the way it gets onto your phone is you just ask for an app called Android Animated Screensaver. Animated album I found when I fixed my female coworker's computer. You're like, I can't resist. This is a dancing hamster for sure. And you click on it, and then it turns out it later downloads the payload, which makes it awfully hard for any form of perimeter defense to work, because once you've got the app, it can now securely communicate with the mothership and download the bad stuff. And this is from Juniper Networks, their estimates of cumulative Android malware up to 13,000 samples in December when there were only 400 in June of 2011. That's not a great trend. It's the kind of thing that I think will make the Android more iPhone-like rather than the iPhone more Android-like over time. So we see this model of installing new gatekeepers as against the user of the machine, initially for the user's own good, spreading throughout the ecosystem. Whether it's because the PC itself is becoming more iPhone and gatekeeper-like, or because more and more the PC is just a browser. It's another window that's not supposed to run any code but a browser, and it just goes to things like the Facebook platform or other things. And it's those platforms then that choose to exercise gatekeeper control. Even as simple as any website using Facebook Connect, they get into trouble with Facebook, that's the end of the relationship. So there was this game called Critter Island with 150 million users, and Facebook got upset, possibly rightfully so. It's something they were doing, and you end up with this is their monthly user graph. And that is something, if you're a company, you should be extremely concerned about. And if you're not a company, you should be extremely concerned about, because it's not just if they offend Facebook, it's if they offend any power that can credibly remonstrate with Facebook, you end up with trouble as well. So some of you may remember this incident on the tethered device, the Kindle. People had happily downloaded 1984 for only 99 cents from some third-party seller going through the Amazon store. The third-party seller thought that it was public domain. It turns out it's only public domain in Canada. It's still under copyright in the US. Amazon had a litter of kittens when it found that out. And they reached into every Kindle that had 1984 in it and deleted 1984. So I know. It's like, you don't have 1984. You never had 1984. There's no such book as 1984. And as you go from the open environments to these, where what you're doing is getting a tethered copy of the book, it may be locally reposing in your machine, but it's still no closer to you than if it were in the cloud, because the cloud is where the control is. Control defines whether it's yours, not physical nearness to the bits. And that is now the Kindle or Google Books, you name it. All of these are cloud-based models where a third party has the key. And I see things like locks, lots of copies keep stuff safe, and other projects nascent to try to keep the integrity of these works good over time, so they don't just change in the cloud while you're sleeping. They are not widely deployed at all. This is another just great example on a Nook, War and Peace, and somebody's reading it, and they're like, a vivid glow nooked, like, what? What is a nooked glow? Splinters nooked by the tinder? What the hell is going on here? And then they're like, wait a minute. Every time the word Kindle was going to appear, it's been replaced with Nook. Which it turns out is a lot if you are Leo Tolstoy, because just by sheer volume, everything is a lot. He used all the words a lot. And this was not Barnes & Noble doing this. This was a third-party ebook maker who had done it for the Kindle and wanted to convert it over and probably had some advertising pablum at the end. Read other books in our Kindle store, and did a quick search and replace. But it just shows you how easily you can defeat the integrity of stuff in an environment that we thought was going to be safer. So I think of this whole zone like a Web 2.0 enabled toaster. Like the regular toaster, you put toast in, you get toast out. I guess I should be more precise. You put bread in, you get toast out. Sorry. That was like a big mistake in front of this crowd. So the Web 2.0 version, though, would be it's making toast, and then on Wednesday it says, like, congratulations, you just got the August update, and you now have 4 slots. You're like, well, that's cool. And you come back later in the day, it's like, sorry, we had to roll it back. We apologize for any toast that was crushed in the rollback. And then the next week you come in and it's making orange juice. And you're like, what did I buy? And the answer is you bought nothing. You have entered into a long-term relationship with a breakfast-oriented service provider. And don't worry, cryptographic keys are ensuring that the weird stuff it does is only coming from the vendor that you are now permanently in a relationship with. That is not my vision of a great future. And one other example, just can't resist. OnStar, people may have OnStar in their vehicles. You press the little button and you say, help, I've fallen, I can't get up. And this woman says, hi, I'm here to help you. She's the OnStar lady. This is the actual OnStar lady. And The FBI woke up one morning and was like, wait a minute, why don't we simply, if we have somebody that we have interest in, we'll get the right paperwork done, and then we will simply ask that the microphone in the rearview mirror be turned on. And let's just listen to all conversations in the car through the OnStar system. And they asked an OnStar-like company that provided this to do it, and the company was like, oh no, and agreed, but under protest. And they actually filed the following lawsuit, the company versus the United States of America, because they wanted to keep themselves anonymous because nobody would buy this if they knew the FBI could do it. And it turns out actually they lost in an opinion under seal in the district court. The FBI had the right to do this. It goes up on appeal, and the Ninth Circuit says the FBI can't do it in its current way because the way it was implemented was to put the car into help, help, I've fallen and I can't get up mode, which means that if, in fact, the crooks in the car hit the help button, it still only goes to the FBI and not to the lady, and the FBI presumably would not come and help. So that was a problem. If they can work out that bug, no problem. And now we're back into tinfoil hat territory because you realize, hell, you don't just need it to be in your car. It could just be any smartphone, which is a general-purpose computer like the 360 kind of general-purpose computer, and we can reprogram it at a distance, simply turn on the mic, record everything in the recorder, and then when you've got a decent bandwidth, upload the whole conversation. That's the kind of stuff that says to me we're entering a zone in which crypto is not making us safer. It's introducing a host of new problems that we might not have intended. And just one other quick example, I don't know if people have followed the Cisco Cloud Connect controversy. If you have a Cisco router, now they're making the management of the router done through the cloud, through a firmware update that comes automatically. And in the terms of service, somebody noticed, because they had been kind of boilerplate copied and pasted, that Cisco reserves the right to intervene to stop any illegal or inappropriate activity. So it's like, wait, I'm using my router and now Cisco's going to get in the middle of it? Very strange. Or a few years ago, Skype teamed up with TOM in China to offer a locally branded version of Skype. And Skype, you might recall, given to us by the people who made Kazaa. What could possibly be insecure about that? And Skype, in this version, it turns out, was discovered to be looking at all instant messages, and when it found certain stop words, it would be storing them on a server for later review, presumably, by somebody other than the people engaged in the conversation. So this wonderful report kind of showed it, and it kind of understates it, because they were able, by tracing the software, to look onto the server and get the logs for everyone, not just their own, but the logs of all conversations that were being monitored in the 5 major Skype Tom server. And this kind of, made news. There's the details, great paper. And it got a New York Times story out of it. Huge surveillance monitors it. Here's the Skype response. The security and privacy is very important. Okay, that's good. This doesn't affect the core technology or functionality. You can still have all of the conversations you want. They just have the added feature of being monitored by others. And it just exists within an administrative layer on the servers. We've expressed our concern. They think a fix will be completed, and eBay had no further comment on the monitoring. You can still get this software today. There's kind of this weird outrage deficit over this sorts of stuff, which again lead me to ask, what good is E2E if the endpoints aren't secure? And here I'm not asking it in the sense of they could be hijacked at any moment by a virus from anywhere. Here I mean it in the sense of they could be hijacked directly by the company with whom you are working at the behest of a third party, like a government. And that greatly upsets a status quo in the opposite direction from that which the introduction of PGP was thought to be disrupting the status quo. If you're a government, you have far more means now of listening in on people than you do. And you can do it by hook or by crook. And that's why you see kind of governments responding in a split personality way. You have the FBI saying cyber attacks pose the greatest danger to this country and presumably to others, next only to a bomb in one of our major cities or a weapon of mass destruction. And on the other hand, you have the Air Force saying something like, you know what, we want a suite of hacker tools to give us access to and full control of any kind of computer there is. That is our goal, dominant cyber offensive engagement, which I think is a theoretical matter. We really need to ask of the governments and have them ask of themselves, in this realm, if that's my goal, am I making a more secure world? Do I really think that I can do that while having everybody else within my purview protected against that from other governments. Once Stuxnet gets out there, how hard is it to reverse engineer it and use whatever insight is within it to be redeployed for other purposes? Is there something about it that makes it really hard to maintain an asymmetry? And of course, the Air Force is thinking defense as well. They ran this ad a while ago.
This building will be attacked 3 million times today. Who's going to protect it? Meet Staff Sergeant Lee Jones, Air Force Cyber Command, a member of America's only cyber command, protecting us from millions of cyber threats every day. It takes Air Force technology to defend America in a changing world. U.S. Air Force, above all. Learn more about our changing world at airforce.com.
Cyberspace, because the word space is in cyberspace too. And it's sort of funny though, because like that did seem like a pretty cool place to be, right? Lots of cool monitors and everything. It actually turns out that they suspended the program not long after having that ad. Here's 2009. They finally established a reduced cyber command. And I got to say, truth in advertising, that does not look like what I saw in the video. If I enlisted on an 8-year contract and I'm ushered into this room like, okay, get started, I would feel extremely disappointed. So in the meantime, you see, like, I love this. This DARPA-funded device will hack your network. It's like, why DARPA? Why? Now, I think within this group, you're going to be like, because it's fun. Like, look, it's a power strip, and it hacks your machine. You just plug it in, and everything goes south. Isn't that cool? And the answer is like, no, that is not cool. That is bad. And then you're like, oh, well, I just invented it to show how bad this could be. And, like, won't tell you anymore. This is the kind of stuff that says we're in an arms race right now, where what you can't get through the front door, through some kind of subpoena or other administrative documents given to a provider, you'll try to get through the back door if you're a government or otherwise a source of a, quote, advanced persistent threat. In the meantime, I love how the British a while ago announced that they were going to get iPod docks and surround sound in their warships. And it's like, that's a great idea. Why not? So we have this zone, and the question is, what do we do about it? And I say what we do about it is we need to turn back to the mode of the civic technology to figure out how to meet the genuine challenges that have come about in this wonderfully open and chaotic environment. And that's this corner of my grid. It's bottom up. It's coming from nobody with particular privilege, but it's so successful and compelling that enough people might subscribe and participate that it has its own hierarchical quality. It's harder for the bad apples and the bad people to opt out of participating in such a system. And we see this. This is why this YouTube hijacking was not permanent. It was only 2 hours long, not because of anything YouTube or Google did, but because there's NANOG, the North American Network Operators Group. You know, people who'd rather on a nice day be in a windowless room and using non-proportional font, and they're emailing with each other, and some of them are employees, mid-level employees at ISPs, and they say, look, YouTube's IP block has been hijacked. This is not just a case of YouTube engineers doing something stupid. And here are some of the paths you can do to change your own routers manually, not to be repeating the poison within the BGP network, repeat the good stuff, and enough people reprogram their routers in the right places that that message started to trump the earlier message coming from Pakistan, and you got YouTube back up again. And I think this model, which kind of metaphorically speaking does have its issues, but this model of people who are participating not specifically for a paycheck, but because they identify with trying to do something for the greater good in a community of people that might not be appreciated for it, that model is what keeps the internet and things like Wikipedia up and running most of the time. So when you see stuff like this happen, this is in Egypt when the plug was pulled on internet, you see some attempts to deploy mesh networking with common devices that people have in order to keep the networks up and running. That's an example of that. And we see people using Facebook around the world, and the question is, all right, well, how much can Facebook be trusted? Are there ways to put something on the Facebook platform that is going to make it more trustworthy? Or this at the content layer, Ushahidi, which allows people to report trouble spots as they happen and help others when there is no central 911 to call that you can rely on to be helping. And that's why when I say end of crypto, I don't think I mean really, as I've been using it, the finality of crypto, the end of it that way. I instead mean it thinking about the purpose or aim of crypto. What are we ultimately here to be doing with it? And for that, I can only turn to Varus for his advice. Let's see. Varus, are you there?
Are you fond of riddles?
Why? Am I about to hear one?
3 great men sit in a room, a king, a priest, and a rich man. Between them stands a common sellsword. Each great man bids the sellsword kill the other 2. Who lives, who dies?
Depends on the sellsword.
Does it? He has neither crown, nor gold, nor favor with the gods.
He has a sword, the power of life and death.
But if it's swordsmen who rule, why do we pretend kings hold all the power?
I've decided I don't like riddles.
Okay. So they're a little bit of a parable, but when I'm talking about the governments, those are the kings. When I'm talking about the corporate sector, those are the riches. I don't know where the priests fit in. I'm working on that. But also notice that he doesn't mention the people at all. The peasants are just not in the picture. But you get that you guys are the sellswords, right? You are the ones forging and using the technology and able to do something with it, for which I think it is fair to ask Oppenheimer's question of to what end can this, should this go? And not necessarily to try to code what you do to embed within that code whatever limits you think are appropriate, although that has been done before, but also to recognize that you may be, for right or wrong, in a position of privilege, able to say something to the world at large in the scientists say category that might have an ethical or normative valence about how you think these things that you are part of bringing into the world ought to be used. Now, what should those things be? I'm the last one to kind of say, but just to put something on the table, I can say, look, one end of crypto maybe is the protection of the freedom to securely communicate. That's a very valence term. It has the word freedom in it. Like, this is not just a technical definition. And then you're like, well, what about exceptions? What if we want something so that a third party can listen in with a warrant sort of thing? Are we against any form of warranted eavesdropping? I mean, I've watched The Wire. It seemed like the cops were sometimes doing good things. And there you're like, well, I don't know. We got to figure out how exceptions are to be handled. But to say handled under law is too simple, because law takes too many forms around the world, including in jurisdictions where there is not rule of law. It really is kings rather than duly elected representatives. So maybe there should be some give there. And the other idea is the protection of the freedom to share discriminately. In my own head, that's a big part of what crypto is. I want this music to only go to the person who purchased it and not to that person's friends. Or they can only choose 5 friends and it only goes to them. Or I want this Facebook photo to only be shared with the people I designate in this list. Or I want this screed only to be available to Democrats and not Republicans. Right? That could be done. Finally, we're going to have some voter ID and we can, make sure it only goes to Democrats. But, yeah, I know, that was doubly ironic. But this is the sort of thing that crypto is under. And I start to see things like I don't know where it's at right now, the Tahoe file system, the idea of being able to devote just a little part of spare storage you have to be part of distributed storage for other people's files, and you can't understand what's there. You're just offering it up to the commonweal, and in turn, you get to use some of it. All of that seems like a pretty cool idea that will inevitably trigger some of the worries about its disruptive capacity to the status quo. Or the idea that says, look, we're making progress in searching encrypted data, which means why should all of my Gmail or my Outlook mail be in plain text on the damn server, protected only because they say they will? Why not encrypt it all, and then I can still search it as an encrypted corpus? Well, there are technical issues with that. There's also the problem of they don't get to do contextual advertising with that if they don't know what they're doing. Well, maybe move the contextual advertising client side. These are the sorts of things that can try to make it so that the enormous amounts of data we are suddenly making available, which alone changes the status quo, can have some limit on reproducibility. This is a new burglar alarm system I installed. And I was amazed to find that every single time a door is open, whether or not the system is armed, it records and immediately sends to the cloud and keeps a record of. Every door open, every door close, every motion sensor gone to the cloud because they just have the terabytes to do it. Why not? It could be useful someday. This is the kind of stuff that maybe shouldn't be stored in plain text on the destination server. Or this example is the Burns Library at Boston College. Boston College started something a few years ago called the Belfast Project. They interviewed people who had been associated with the Irish Republican Army. They did so with promises of confidentiality, and many people for the first time acknowledged their involvement in the organization and the things that they had done, with the idea being that they would only be released after they died. And this is one such thing that was released after a death. And on the interview, do you have a problem with committing this to a secret tape to be used after you die? I don't have a problem with that. If I did, I wouldn't be sitting here. A lot of the stuff I'm saying on trust, because I have trust in you. I've never, ever admitted to being a member of the IRA, never. And I've just done it here from Brendan Hughes, who died in 2008. That tape came free. So all right, the British government is like, wait a minute, you have other tapes with stuff, material to still open crimes that were committed. They go through the U.S. State Department and they lodge a letter rogatory and then a subpoena saying, give me the tape. And that has now gone through the court system in which BC has been consistently losing. And the question is, what will happen here? And the underlying question is, this is how they protected it. There was a confidentiality agreement. They used a coding system, and by that they mean they didn't put names at the top of the interviews. Instead, they put numbers, and then they had a list indexing numbers to names. And they were all going to be stored in Belfast, but they decided they could be only safely stored in the United States. And how do they know it's safe? Because it's stored in the treasure room of the library with extremely limited access. This is the treasure room we're talking about. And now it's open to exposure. So my question is, should there be a cryptographic system that says, I want this locked up from everybody for 20 years? And only in 20 years is that key going to be available, either because that's how long it's going to take to crack it or because of some other way. Would there be a better world in which BC could not only make that promise, but keep it cryptographically as against any form of subpoena? Or the opposite. I remember in 2001, a company called Disappearing Inc., which then disappeared, INC, Disappearing, but they were like, imagine email that can self-destruct after a certain amount of time, leaving no trace. They've created software to do just that. All right, so over-promising a little. But we could see now in a cloud-based environment how to do that sort of thing. Good idea or bad idea? At the very least, I say, if it's good enough for 1984 that can be disappeared at any moment, maybe it should be good enough for my personal email, you know, like sauce for the goose sort of thing. These are the kinds of questions. I mean, this is a blog called Awkward Something or Others, family portrait sort of thing. Bucolic meadow with split rail fence. Is that an animal carcass behind her? And you're like, you know, I think it is actually. Very odd. There was somebody who just wanted his or her image taken out, and the person operating the blog agreed. Would it be a better or a worse web in which data were linked enough that if I pull it back from the source, it disappears almost everywhere it has gone? I don't purport to know the answer to that question, but I see that there are ways in which we can, use crypto in ways that are meant to ask the question, whose freedom are we enhancing here? Whose autonomy are we enhancing? Ditto for, I only want people in Israel to see this, or I only want people in Israel not to see this video. That's the Democrat and the Republican thing. In conclusion, we had at one time in the United States a system of slavery in roughly half the states. And then there were conflicts over the border, quite literally, of slaves who escaped, and should the North have to return them to the South. And the North made a political accommodation with the South before the Civil War that they would return those slaves. And in order to do so, they had to get a posse together, because law enforcement was not professionalized so much yet. They have to call people together to help return an escaped slave. And you know what? People just didn't turn up. They're like, I'm sorry, I'm shampooing my cat. And that ended up being a limit on the exercise of state power simply because people didn't want to do it. And one question I think is worth asking, it's the question of constitutional law, which tries to divide power among different branches, separation of powers, have an independent judiciary, all this kind of stuff. It's all about putting power in different places so that only when multiple keys are turned does the missile actually launch of some enforcement of state action. And in fact, we can see crypto systems that way too. I have something that I can't decrypt alone, but I'm needed, and so too does my neighbor in another country have to put in the key for it to be decrypted. That's the sort of thing that says within this room are ideas to deploy crypto towards human autonomy and freedom. And this XKCD cartoon summarizes it pretty well. Are you coming to bed? I can't. This is important. What? Someone is wrong on the internet. That is energy worth harnessing. And to put it more formally and finally, in 1955, Albert Einstein and Bertrand Russell were really concerned about nuclear warfare, the weapons that Einstein, at least, had, of course, been instrumental in bringing about. And they published a declaration, a notice to the world, in which they tried to make their views known as people, but also as scientists who'd had a hand in bringing it about. And the key line, of course, from it was, remember your humanity and forget the rest. That's the element for which asking about what is the end of crypto and who better to take the lead in answering that question than the people in this room today. Thank you very much.